Good afternoon and welcome to BizTech Midday Market Watch. Our guest today is Vishnu Varathan, Head of Economics and Strategy at Mizuho Bank. Vishnu, great to have you on the show.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me, Brian.
Now, Vishnu, there's been a lot of noise about the US elections which are happening next week on the 3rd, but a very important event is taking place this week. Currently, the Fifth Plenum of the 19th Communist Party Congress is being held. And that's where the blueprint for the 14th five-year plan will be endorsed by members of the party elite. Now, Vishnu, can you walk us through some of the key topics and policies that are being discussed and approved? Now, starting with GDP goals and the reform agenda.
Sure. And Brian, that's a very good point. So this is like the continuous movement of the tectonic plates. We don't feel it until after some time. So it is indeed an important part of ongoing China plans. On GDP, and before we get to that, in case some of the some of us are looking for headlines, we need to be aware that the discussions are going on now. It's a rather fluid, continuous process, and we may only hear of this next year. So the announcements may not come so quickly in terms of the headlines, unlike elections and other headlines that we watch. But for GDP, the big question for markets is how much lower than 6% may China put its guidance? So they're of course going to look past near-term pandemic effects. And our sense is that China will probably lower this, at least for the purposes of optics, to between 5 to 5.5% growth. So that will not knock them off their wealth generation and income lifting goals. But at the same time, it will also, I think, align with the fact that structurally, China's growth is on a slower platform. And they will then marry this with the reforms they're doing. So their entire reform premise is this, that they are moving from just targeting growth quantity to going on to establishing a certain quality of growth. And that's I think, remains quite fundamental in economics, not just due to distribution effects. It's not just about how this growth is distributed, but also what gives rise to this growth. Is it borrowed from the future? Is it by currency devaluation? And here, I think China is going to put a lot of emphasis on the fact that they are going on very high innovation track, particularly high-tech growth. They're also going to rely a bit on ongoing SOE reforms to make sure that they remain very productive, highly specialized, and there will be a certain segment of it that also goes on to urbanization. They're going to go further with urbanization because China is able to lift its farm productivity very well. So this is very much in line with inclusive, high quality growth, especially as China's population ages, because they know that they can't achieve growth simply by adding to workforce. They need to raise productivity.
And also, you brought up this key point about the innovation and obviously China 2020 looms, 2025 looms in the horizon. Walk us through a little bit in terms of what are the key things that the market is expecting in the innovation space, especially given the right of the trade wars, and also with regard to commodities and energy policy.
So this is probably how we want to look at China's innovation. One is whatever is going to be laid out in this particular growth plan is not going to be a revelation or a game changer. For a long time now, China has been wanting to move up the value chain. It's going into very high-tech areas. And in fact, we see evidence of that right now. If you look at China's onshore payment system is far more advanced than anywhere else, not just in Asia, but in the world. They are also very advanced in terms of facial recognition, AI, and they're trying to really get into the green energy space, and they already have a lot of leadership and advanced technologies in 5G. I think so. Really, whatever that's going to be laid out in terms of innovation would be twofold. One would be to marry across all of this, make these technologies coherent, and really push the boundaries further in terms of establishing this. Second, and more importantly, there is a certain strategic aspect to this. The more important aspect for them is to ensure that they have got some supply chain security, specifically with a re-emergent US-China conflict going on. China probably finds itself in a space where they are unable to, or they're at risk of not being able to derive some of the intermediate, very high-tech components. So some of this innovation plan will also focus on getting scaling up and really advancing technology much faster to ensure that they've got some security in terms of being able to acquire domestically without outside reliance on very high-tech components that go into a lot of these very advanced technologies like AI, facial recognition, 5G,
But
and
Vishnu,
beyond.
some of the things that you've mentioned, some of those technologies, China is actually already the leader. And one of the key things that probably, in line of what you talked about, is really them setting up a completely alternative supply chain, which includes their own ecosystem.
Absolutely. I mean, one reason, and that's a good point, Brian, the reason why, to a certain extent, the reason why they've been so advanced in this is because they were able to roll it out on a scale that's not possible anywhere else in the world, and perhaps with fewer regulatory or opposing forces than anywhere else in the world. So the adoption of these technologies and the resistance to these technologies are much lower in China. So they have this ability to advance it. Now, the question for them is, are they able to secure it and establish a leadership onshore first, so that at least they can then be viable and self-reliant on an external basis. So this partly mitigates the US-China conflict that is actually been rising, and it's set to stay there. So regardless of the presidential outcomes in the US, we have to come to terms with the fact that US-China tensions will be high. This growth plan and their 5-year plan certainly recognizes that they're not going to delude themselves about it, which is why this self-reliance comes about. And in doing so, they have also formulated a so-called dual circulation economy. So the reason why they have done this is they're also including a large part of domestic consumption alongside external growth, exports-driven growth, as part of their growth strategy here. This then ties up very nicely with the innovation question, because onshore innovation can then be boosted if they're able to lift it together with domestic consumption. Now, the important point to note here is that dual circulation should not lead us to believe that China is going to become closed off and inward looking. Anything but. I think they know
Yeah,
very well that they,
could that dual circulation, and there have been indications of that the dual circulation policy, far from being just an inward looking policy, may in fact signal perhaps a greater pivot towards Asia.
I mean, absolutely. I think certainly that the dual circulation is just saying, look, there are two aspects to this. One is a very tactical positioning, because Asia is going to be coming out and the rest of the world is trying to come out of a pandemic on much worse footing than China. So as not to lose its growth momentum, it must rely partly on domestic growth momentum in the next 5 years. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect, as we discussed earlier, is strategic. Is to ensure that they've got enough consumption to back up their innovation ambitions. So the innovation ambitions must be backed up by a viable and a stronger consumption-based domestic market. So these are the things. And how does that fit in with the rest of Asia? I think this is where things get a little bit more fluid. What we might find is, because it will come with trade-offs. So because they need to scale up very quickly, it also means they need to give up some other industries at a faster rate. So you'd find that this would create opportunities for economies such as Vietnam and the emerging economies to pick up a lot of this and also scale up themselves. In the near term, they will be much more reliant on a diverse source of intermediate goods. So Malaysia, Korea, Japan, Taiwan are still well set to benefit from this. But as they progress, there's also a certain aspect where China becomes a competitor as well as a consumer of these goods. And that is where I think the dynamics will start shifting somewhat. But China eventually will be leading in a lot of this and will be in a place to incorporate its supply chain and cost advantages and spread it over the rest of Asia. It may be hard to envisage that now because we think of China as a low-cost producer. But if you think about it, if they go up the value chain, then part of the strategy would also be to get a cost-effective supply chain across Asia to entrench some of the advantages and dominance they're looking to establish.
And also then create markets for their products, for these high-end products, to essentially replace the Western products that most of, say, ASEAN is high-end, high-tech products, which is most of ASEAN and the rest of Asia Pacific is currently consuming?
I think definitely that's going to be a core part of the strategy. What would be interesting for us to see is how they execute this, because in the very near term, they understand there could be suspicions around their technologies or pressures to not adopt it as quickly as we've seen with the 5G, what the US is doing. So really what China needs to work on is the hard technology to get it to be the undisputed leader, and on the soft sell of this technology to the rest of the region. So it is an interesting time. They are probably going to do a lot of beta testing onshore first. And you can also see part of the dual circulation strategy, interestingly for us, would also mean that what they might do then with it is that they would need to reprioritize. It doesn't change anything, but priority-wise, some of the Belt and Road initiatives that China was embarking on, they may become less aggressive about it. And this is really towards the longer game of getting the buy-in and the adoption of what China is going for.
Thank you for your fascinating insights, Vishnu. We've been speaking to Vishnu Varathan, Head of Economics and Strategy at Mizuho Bank on BizTech Midday Market Watch. I'm Brian Fernandez. Check out www.biztech.com